Shaun here from the Shaun Tabatt Show. In this episode, I am going to introduce you to a fantastic apologetics book. It's published by my friends at Zondervan, and it's called Telling a Better Story, How to Talk About God in a Skeptical Age, and that is written by none other than Joshua Chatraw. And what was really interesting to me in terms of this book, I wasn't looking to this as a book to help me be better at apologetics or to be better at evangelism. What really intrigued me was how Josh does a great job of helping us understand how story is a part of everybody's world, and that we use stories to help shape and frame and understand how we are interacting with our own world. And so for me, my interest in this book was to engage with the content to help me become a better storyteller as I'm making content for the podcast, as I'm making content for all of the various places I'm posting video online. And so whether you're looking to engage in a different way as you're interacting with people at work, as you're interacting with people when you're just out in society, I think this book could be a very big help to show you how things have shifted in culture and to help you understand why the ways you talked about your faith, 5, 10, 15 years ago, why those were received well back then and why those same things may seem to fall flat as you engage with people today. So Telling a Better Story, it is a fantastic read. I highly recommend it, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Joshua Chatraw. It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, dig into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Joshua Chatraw, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Telling a Better Story, How to Talk About God in a Skeptical Age. Josh, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, Josh, this is the very first time you and I are meeting today, so I'd love to kick off our conversation with a bit of what we might call the Joshua Chatraw origin story. So for those of us encountering you for the first time today, what are a few things we need to know about you?
Yeah, well, as far as my religious background, I grew up with Christian parents in a Christian home, and became a Christian in my early teen years, and went through a period in college where I was kind of figuring out if I really believe this stuff, and really dealing with doubts and questions about the faith. And that actually, some of those questions drove me into a lot of education and exploring, and eventually through that felt called into the ministry. And so that's a little bit about my background as far as both kind of getting into what I do now, and how actually the Lord used doubts and questions to do that.
In terms of your education and professional journey, if you had to label it, what would you say has been your primary area of specialization or study?
Yeah, I actually I did my PhD under a New Testament scholar, Andreas Kostenberger. And during that time, I focused on the Gospels, and it actually, opened up some doors into apologetics and public theology, which is primarily my focus now.
And in terms of your journey, would it be fair to say that it was your own quest to find answers that really helped you to see the value in apologetics?
Yeah, I think in part, it was that. And it was also, while I was doing my PhD for 5 years, I was pastoring in a local church. And so when you're working on a PhD and you're a pastor, when people have questions, everyone says, well, go talk to Josh. And so I began to see, even in small town, I wasn't in metropolitan areas. I was in kind of small town Bible Belt places, especially among young people. They had doubts and questions, and it was really wanting to just try to help them. And at times, and then, that I dove even deeper into this. So it was partly a practical need in my own life. And it was also just trying to help and minister to other people.
And as a guy who works in the publishing industry, I'm always curious to find out how a project got started. So in terms of this book, what was the catalyst or spark that set you down the path of writing the book?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a tradition where I was taught to share my faith. And And even I went to a state school and played college soccer and was one of the few Christians on the team. And even at that time in the South, there was a kind of warmth to Christianity. There was a kind of, even though that my teammates and other people at the school, they might not have been buying in or wanted to adopt that lifestyle, they respected me for my beliefs. They kind of thought, hey, well, Josh is a good guy. He does the right thing because of these beliefs. And yet I saw, even in 15 years in the South, even in the Bible Belt, how things have radically shifted now, where for a lot of people, the assumptions about Christianity being kind of a good thing for society are no longer there, and there wasn't quite the warmth that it once had. So that was kind of just seeing on a practical level, like, hey, talking to people, talking to friends and neighbors and coworkers about faith has changed, and I saw how the church wasn't really equipped and wasn't really equipping people to have these conversations. And it also started particularly because I was teaching at a university. And so I had a lot of students who were going into the ministry, and the way they were being trained to kind of do evangelism and apologetics, there was a real disconnect between the way they were being trained and how I saw conversations needing to work. And so with that, in 2014, I started writing a book with my colleague called Apologetics at the Cross, which was really a textbook. And then from that, though, as we were writing it and developing that book, we saw the need for a book for the whole church, not really a kind of textbookish type genre, but something that was going to connect with folks who didn't want to read a textbook. And so my co-author blessed me to kind of do this project. So it really started in 2014, and I started writing this Telling a Better Story just a couple of years ago.
Your book is just one of many books, I feel like, in the past 10 to 15 years where there's been this move from scholars to take topics that they're discussing kind of in the ivory tower of academia, if you will, and bring them down to a popular level, which I think is so wonderful, where you have people who are total experts in their area of study and they're making things palatable just for the average person. I always want to say for the person in the pew, but I feel like that's a reference that's largely lost on people today. In terms of stories, why are tales and stories an important part of helping us to understand our life's journey? I know that that's a thing, but I think people often they're not actively thinking about how much their worldview, how they kind of process and go about life is actually informed and shaped by the stories they've been told. So why are tales and stories important?
I would say story is the common universal language in a sense. I mean, because I would say we're storytelling animals. This is how we make sense of the world. We observe, we experience, we observe things, and then we put it together through story. We think about our past life and our experience in the past through story. We imagine the future through story. And so I would say this is just part of who we are. And because we think in story, we imagine in story, we dream in story, we're sucked in by story, rather than saying, okay, I need to have a conversation about the gospel. Now let me kind of go into to 4 steps or maybe a logical syllogism. Why don't we start with story? And by the way, the gospel is a story. And so I think that there's a link, even in a secular culture, even a culture that's becoming, in one sense, secular. There's a lot that we might mean by that word. We can talk about that if we want to in a second. But even in a culture that says, hey, we don't believe in the supernatural, we're just using logic and reason, we just believe in science. I would say stories form us, and even that kind of, someone saying that is actually formed by a story more than they realize. And so I think we can use story as a way to talk about the gospel. It is a story, and people are already living in light of a story no matter if they realize it or not.
I want to pull on the thread kind of that you just mentioned about secular, or, I'll often use the word mainstream because I feel like secular often has some challenging implications. So in terms of the publishing industry and authors I encounter, I talk about mainstream books versus Christian books. But I've found I not only interview Christian authors, like I would say my content split is about 60% faith content and then 40% other, be it marketing, personal development, business, stuff that, challenges me in the other areas of my life, not just my faith. And I find more often than not, people who are writing in a mainstream or secular context, they're often wanting to go after, pursue, they're worried about the same things that people are on the Christian side of the aisle, if you will. They're just using different language, they're using different stories to inform, how they're going about life, how they're doing the things they're doing. And that's been really eye-opening to me because as a guy who went to a Christian college, I've worked in Christian publishing for a long time. I've spent a lot of time inside the bubble. And as I take time outside the bubble just to encounter people who aren't necessarily Christian at all, it's been very fascinating to see that they're wanting to pursue the same things we're wanting to pursue. It's just they're shaping it with different stories.
One of the things I'm trying to do in the book is to say there's key features of human personhood, or the way that N.T. Wright puts it in a recent book and in an academic book is he calls these vocational signposts. And really saying the same thing. He's saying vocational in that, we're made as humans for a certain vocation, and these vocations point to something beyond. And I'm just saying that, humans are going to be on a quest for meaning. We're gonna put significance in something. We're gonna devote ourselves to something. We're gonna go to something for identity. We're gonna seek the good life. We're gonna seek to be happy. We're gonna, we don't want to be irrational. And so there's these things about humans that I think we can start with, and it's often to tie it back into story. The good stories include these things: this quest for the good life, this desire to love and be loved, courage, and this good and evil. So we have these key features of personhood, and then the stories that, whether you're a religious person or not, living in the West, the stories that we love so often include these key features of personhood. And what I'm saying, and what I'm arguing in the book, is that actually Christianity gives a better story that explains all these other stories, that explains these features of personhood that everyone has. And it explains why we go after them in all these different ways. We go after meaning and significance and love in all these different ways. And yet all of these other stories don't actually deliver, but the Christian story does.
And one more question related to how our stories are informed. I think of generations past, often people's stories were informed through their elder family members, maybe more so through literature. I think of when I was growing up, how some of my story was informed maybe more through interactions with friends, or, maybe it was MTV or some of the, handful of sitcoms we may have watched on a weekly basis. Yet we've gone through this very rapid season of change. You really can't be disconnected from a storytelling device that's in your pocket all the time. In terms of our modern day, who are some of the biggest influencers right now who are shaping the narrative, telling the story for our current day?
I think that there's, if I can just add in a little comment on that, Shaun, is that, sometimes, especially recently, people are saying, well, I just follow the data. So sometimes people will suggest that now, like, we've come of age. Like in the past, people would gather around campfires and share stories about meaning. And now we just have our algorithms, and now we're just kind of rational beings, and we don't need these stories. And I just say that that's just not right. I mean, I think data is important, but the way we interpret data, the way we read the data, of course, if we've learned anything in the last 6 months, is that people read the data differently. And so I think data is important. I think those, science is a good thing. We need that, but we have these stories that are shaping us and forming us through the media. And so people will embrace different storylines and will read data according to those storylines. But even in, really profound ways about meaning and identity, I mean, it's through Netflix and YouTube TV, and even the songs we listen to are kind of mini parables that speak to the good life and how we should live our life. And these don't come to us in grand philosophical packages, but they come to us just over and over through these kind of little stories that are embedded in our everyday life, and give us a vision of how we should be living, and where we should be pulling identity from, and what really is significant and what really is valuable.
I think back, like I worked in Christian retail in the late 90s. And like I said, I've been in the industry for a long time. And I think in terms of resources and how we are equipping people in terms of outreach and discipleship and even preaching, I feel like a lot of the things we were trying to do back in the day, like if we try to communicate in some of those same ways today, it completely falls flat. I know some of that is just shifts in culture and understanding and meaning. But overall, like what's changed where people aren't willing to receive the same things from us that they would have received, 10, 20 years ago? Yeah.
I mean, and I think this is where there can be issues on a number of fronts, but the way I speak about it in the book is that we have gone through a couple periods in the kind of history of the West, and to kind of try to pack that into just a couple of minutes of thoughts here, of comments, is that we used to be kind of 50 or 60 years ago in America, Christianity was seen as largely plausible. In other words, that there was a God, and it seemed like, that's largely plausible, and that Christianity is a good thing. And even maybe if Christianity is not quite right, it at least adds value and kind of a high moral ethic and virtue to society. In other words, it's good for us. And so people who would say, I'm not really buying into the Jesus thing would still think but there's probably likely a God, and Christianity has good ethics, and it's a pretty good thing. Well, and with that, so it's not just an idea there, but with that, you had kind of a social pressure for many people to at least attend church. And what happened is we kind of went through this phase where, no longer was there this social pressure, and it was kind of became neutral, to now in many places, not all places, but many places in America, there's actually pressure not to be a part of those Christians, because Christianity is no longer seen as good. It's no longer seen as beautiful, and it's seen as irrational. So those are kind of goodness, beauty, and truth are all kind of undermined in a lot of people's minds, because what a sociologist by the name of Peter Berger said long ago, because of the plausibility structures have changed. And what he means by that is that what we naturally just kind of assume to be good has changed. What we assume to be beautiful has changed. What we assume to be rational has changed. It's not necessarily that people, in most cases, have reasoned their way from the ground up to these positions, but it's more absorbed, again, by the stories and by the institutions of our culture where, well, of course, you just can't believe in supernatural beings, or, of course, Christianity is not good. Look how it's oppressive to humanity. Well, there's a lot of assumptions built in that people haven't reasoned their way to. They've just kind of assumed. Now, why have they assumed it? Again, going back to stories and the institutions of our culture. And so part of learning to have these conversations is to learn how to dive into some of the assumptions that have been made, and kind of learn to dig around and have a conversation that's actually productive, rather than oftentimes we can enter these kind of conversations where we're feeling kind of on the back foot. We're feeling we become too aggressive or hostile, but learning to actually kind of ask questions through story, and that's what I'm trying to lay out in the book.
It sounds like you're taking us into your inside out framework. I don't know if you feel like you've explained it as much as you want to in that last answer, or if you'd like to take us a little bit deeper. But that's the big thing you're introducing us to in the book, is this concept of the inside out framework and how that can allow us to function in these conversations and knowing how to connect God's greater story as people are kind of bringing up some of these other stories. So anything else you'd like to comment on about the inside out framework?
I would just say a few things. One thing is I'd say, based on what I'm proposing, which is a part of who we are, not every part of who we are, but part of who we are is storytelling creatures who live by story and communicate by story. The one way to just really practically to enter a conversation is talk to somebody, whether you've known them for a long time or you've just met them, and say, tell me about your story, or tell me more about your story. And, that oftentimes, in my experience, really opens up communication. Whereas if you think about, versus coming into a conversation and saying, hey, tell me about your worldview, I think people will look at you a little cross-eyed at that point and wonder, okay, what do you have up your sleeve? But if you show genuine interest in somebody and say, hey, I want to hear about your story, but then listen closely. And if you listen closely to that story, oftentimes you're going to find where they're tapping meaning and significance from, where they're looking for love, where they're finding their identity, where, a kind of moral code that they're assuming. And I think those are all connection point, kind of existential connection points that kind of dig deeper into and ask more questions. And so the inside out model is giving a kind of mental scaffolding for these conversations, where we can enter a conversation with somebody saying, what's your story? And as they're talking about it, in our mind saying, okay, what are some things here as they're speaking that I can affirm? And what are some things that I will probably, maybe not right away, but need to come back and challenge? What are some things that if they're consistent on this view and they take it to the logical end, it's going to cause a lot of problems. And while I'm listening and talking to them, I'm looking for things. When I say things I can affirm, I'm saying things like, when you hear somebody and what they're passionate about in their story, they might say something like justice, or, I'm passionate for pursuing justice. And I think that's, biblically, pursuing justice is something that I would want to affirm with them as a Christian, from my biblical perspective. But if they're also saying with that a kind of self-relativism where everyone should just kind of do whatever they want to do, then you don't really have this kind of underpinning for justice. And I want to kind of put those two together, find what these deeper longings and aspirations that they have are that I can affirm, while at the same time show how their story or certain other things that they're affirming actually doesn't match well with this longing that they have. And so that's kind of going inside of their view. It's not starting with where I'm at. It's starting with where they're at, looking for these connection points, while also challenging them on certain things. And then saying, okay, I want to tell you a little bit about the Christian story and how I think it actually, in this case, in the example I'm giving, actually gives you a better story about justice, and how it makes sense of our lives. It makes sense of our experiences. It makes sense of, I would argue, our deeper longings as human beings, and fulfills our deepest aspirations. And so it's an approach where it's not a step-by-step method, but it is giving people a kind of way to actually have productive conversations where we can get to the gospel and then show how the gospel actually is relevant to their lives. Because that's one of the big challenges. I think people see, hey, Christianity's, not relevant. It's not good. It doesn't I don't need Christianity. It's a certain lethargy towards religion and particularly towards Christianity, especially in some secular corners of the West.
Let's jump quickly into kind of the midpoint of the book. That's where you give the readers a chance to see some flesh, if you will, hung on the skeleton of your inside out framework. And I feel like that's one of the most helpful parts of the book, in that you're exposing people to some specific cultural assumptions that we likely will encounter. The one I'd love you to comment on is what you cover in chapter 9. And that's where you take on the cultural assumption that says it's okay to be spiritual, but it's not okay to say that your religion is the only way, or, and this is, I feel like, a big one right now, or attempt to bring it into the public square. That is just a big no-no right now. How can we imagine a better inclusiveness?
So there's some different things going on here. I mean, on religion, I think some people are saying, okay, underneath that claim is that, it's okay for you to be religious, but don't bring it into the public square. It assumes that the public square can be kind of neutral. In other words, you're doing stuff over here with religion, and then we're just kind of, and you have all these unprovable kind of assumptions that you have, but then in the public square, we don't have unprovable assumptions. We just have facts and data, and we're just using secular reasoning. Well, one of the things I show is that's actually not the case. So, and this is kind of widespread amongst scholars. They recognize this, that in a pluralistic age, I mean, we're all taking kind of our deep convictions into the public square. And so this is actually kind of a power play that people want to suggest that they're just using reason when they're using reason combined with lots of kind of other assumptions that can't be proven. So for instance, like human rights, and, you can't just get that using pure reason. As I show in the book, human rights, or this kind of this recognition of the dignity of all people that's largely assumed in that kind of public square, that's actually kind of a leftover from the Christian story. So that when the Christian story was kind of embedded in the West, even after the Enlightenment, even after we kind of said, hey, okay, in this public square, we're not, it's better if we operate without religion, or some have suggested that. And actually, in actuality, they're taking certain assumptions from the Christian story into the public square, and so no one's. That's my first point. No one's actually doing that, and so to ask religious people not to come to the public square is running over not just Christian people, but religious people who of all sorts of religions. I mean, one thing that's often said here is that, well, Christianity is one among religions, among many religions, and they all get, partly, they're all saying basically the same thing. So this is one way to kind of say, hey, it's kind of this pluralism that I show in the book. And one of the things that I show there is that that's disrespectful. That's actually disrespectful to religions, because when you have someone who's saying, Jesus died and rose from the grave, and you have another religion that says he didn't, it's actually disrespecting. And so at times people are wanting to show tolerance to all Christians by saying they're all basically saying the same thing, when in fact, very clearly they're not. And to try to kind of make them all say the same thing is disrespectful to all these different religions. Another thing that's often said at this point is that, well, religion, religious beliefs are just culturally bound. In other words, you're a Christian because you grew up in the West, in a particular country that was Christian, and so they're trying to undermine, this kind of Christianity by saying, hey. Or all religions, by saying it's just culturally bound. The problem with this, of course, is to say that it would undermine their own belief. There's not too many atheists in most traditional societies, so they would be saying, well, atheism is just culturally bound as well. And so these are ways that kind of people are trying to say, hey, we shouldn't listen to religion because it's just culturally bound. Let's just use reason, which isn't. But I'm showing in that chapter that's not the case. And to try to say, hey, we need to be tolerant and therefore make all these religions the same and we can get along, that's actually disrespectful to religions. I think where this goes, in our society today is that it's not just trying to sideline religion, but it's actually trying to sideline people of different views altogether. And I think one of the issues we're experiencing right now, obviously, is a kind of cancel culture, and it's canceling people who disagree with you, and saying, well, we're just not going to listen to you. And that's created a certain environment where people, I think we've got to ask, when we're lacking a common story, as we are as a nation, as we are in the Western culture today, we've got to ask some questions about what worldview or what stories about the world actually could lead to us living well with difference, without trying to say everyone's really saying the same thing, or without just canceling everyone. What story about the world is going to give us a way to live that does actually give us a basis for the dignity of every person? What story about the world actually is non-coercive? What story about the world leads to religious freedom? What story about the world actually attracts people, is from a diversity of backgrounds and cultures? And so rather than saying, okay, let's live without a story, or let's just get down to some kind of raw data and we'll live by that data, kind of a technocratic society, I think what we need to do is we need to ask deeper questions about because we are going to embrace a story, what story provides resources for these deeper aspirations of inclusivity, of tolerance, of acceptance. And in this chapter in the book, I make the case that it's actually the story of a crucified Savior, a God who enters into our world, who dies for his enemies, who commands his followers to love those who persecute them and to pray for them. That gives us the story of a God who created us all humans in his image, and therefore they all humans, not because of what they do, not in some kind of instrumental sense, but because of how they were made as God's image bearers. I think this story actually, again, gets at these kind of deeper desires we have for inclusivity and tolerance and acceptance that secular storylines, as I think we're seeing, don't give.
And Josh, if you had to sum it up, what's that one big idea you hope every single reader hears loud and clear in the pages of Telling a Better Story?
Well, I think maybe I can divide that up into two things. I think one is I hope that people will, on one hand, I hope people will be encouraged that in the midst of a kind of cultural situation where it feels like Christians are on their back heels, that they can step into what I would call cracks in the secular, problems in the secular storylines, and to begin to have conversations. And I think oftentimes I talk to people and they're just discouraged about having these conversations. And I think, and then the message of the book is really, this is how you can do that. And then let me not only describe how you do this, but let me actually show you in many, different examples of how this can be done in conversation. It doesn't have to be us versus them. It can be a kind of an invitational approach to come, taste, and see this is good, this is beautiful, and this is true. And we see that in the person of Christ.
And Josh, for the listeners who'd like to connect with you, find out more about the book, where should we go on the web to do that?
Yeah, you can just follow me on Twitter, which is just at Josh Chatraw. My last name is spelled Chatraw.
All right, and like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Josh and pick up your own copy of the book as well. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Thanks for being a part of my conversation with Joshua Chatraw. Once again, our book today was Telling a Better Story, How to Talk About God in a Skeptical Age. Like Josh said, be sure to follow him on Twitter and then head over to your favorite retailer and pick up a copy of this book as well. And Josh, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's truly been an honor and a privilege to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.